And so I have the pleasure of welcoming back Carl, where he's going to talk about where things are going in our industry, even beyond IoT. So with that, I'd like to welcome to the stage Carl Russo. Thank you very much, sir.
Good morning. First of all, we're flattered by your attendance. Thank you all for taking the time. It's really marvelous to sit back there and watch these presentations and understand what you all are doing and what's coming. The theme of this show, once imagined, now real, when applied by all of our customers, really means you're becoming a disruptor. We believe these technologies, these software platforms, these tools, these analytics, allow you to become a disruptive force, not merely a service provider. And so what I want to do is spend time about applying these real tools to becoming a disruptor. And so apparently the screen is disrupting. But for those of you that remember last year, I'd like to just wait one moment. And I suspect many of you were here last year, because if we look back, it's been an amazing year. If we look around the world and what's changed just in these last 365 days, really amazing. But in our industry, we've gotten used to the fact that that's just another amazing year. The rate of progress, last year we talked about the Internet of Things, the device-enabled subscriber, and there was an array of devices on this stage. Some are here, most of these are new. That's a fact. Maybe last year you remember this guy. This is a robot, an autonomous robot walking on an uncertain surface. By the way, he's learned new tricks this year. Want to see a really new trick? Watch this. That's not a guy standing inside that. That is literally an autonomous system making those decisions, balancing. Very early in my educational career, I had a chance to invest a good deal of time in artificial intelligence. That is a darn difficult thing to do. I could sit up here and watch this all day long. And he steals all the headlines. What I like is that I'm referring to him as a him. By the way, for most people that interface with robots, they actually personalize them. This is not an unusual thing today. What is interesting to me is that he gets all the headlines, but in fact, this just keeps on going. 10 years ago, when we began this journey towards a unified access infrastructure, the platforms that you see today and tomorrow, we actually used to talk about 4K TVs. How are we going to make them work on the network? I suspect many of you remember that. Well, while that guy was doing backflips, these have all changed. And we don't even talk about it. This progression is continuous, and we don't even talk about it. Why? Because we have a backflipping robot to spend time with, and other distractions these days. So, what does this mean to all of us? An enormous demand. Look at the numbers. These are just TVs, from 1 to 90. If you do the math, that is a 25% relentless compound growth. Relentless. Way back here at 1 meg, we were trying to figure out, can we handle this? How are we going to do this on our networks? This is going on underneath our feet every single day. By the way, yes, an 8K HD TV is 4 times a 4K HD TV. I know the math doesn't sound right, but you actually have to square it, and that's why. The more pedestrian is changing as well. What's the more pedestrian? Our personal, portable devices. And you look at these screens and these applications, we all know. It used to be I was watching the introduction of the iPhone the other day, and it was, Steve Jobs always did a very good job of saying things like, it's a huge screen, 3.5 inches. But back then, it was revolutionary. Now, you can barely get your phone in your pocket. iPads at much higher resolution, virtual reality. The resolution of these screens, the contextual richness of them, the content that's driving them, continues unabated, just like those TV screens. They're just smaller. The difference? Well, the difference is we might front up and buy one TV. But we're not buying one device. We have devices all over the place. A couple of years back, I asked all of you, how many devices do you have? A few years before that, people could actually count the number of devices they have. Today, there's no chance. We all have devices that we can't even think about that are connected to the infrastructure all the time. That's what's going on from a network standpoint, and we're watching a robot do backflips. This is not going to stop. It will continue and continue on into the future. And so over the years, we have talked about what that end state network looks like. What does it look like in the future when we can build a network that will handle all of this? If you remember, the network looked like this. We had device-enabled subscriber, content and applications in the cloud. We spoke about the fact that when you can assume a broadband connection, I'm going to design devices and put the content over here. If I'm an engineer, I'm not going to burden the device with having to run the application or hold on to the content. It all gets pushed into the cloud. The cloud has a data center at the edge. That data center is connected via a fiber to a splitter, because we talked about trunk and tributary and natural systems. That splitter is going to have fibers that come out of it. Those fibers are going to have colors over them, because if you remember, those colors allow for a point-to-point network to be built on top of a shared network. And on the end of those fibers, antennas. That's the end state network. It doesn't mean we can get there today, although some can, because they're literally building a greenfield service provider. But if we're going to go on a journey, I would submit it'd be really cool to have a destination. That's the destination. Everything I just showed you, this is eminently capable of taking care of. So, is there anything in the last year that may have affected this view? Well, many of you have probably seen some things like, anybody seen the Facebook internet plane? It's a solar-powered, electric-driven internet plane that's going to provide internet to everyone and remove the need for all of us. Google has their own take on this, which is the Google balloon. I assume everyone's heard of this. Well, what's the update to this? Well, the plane's grounded, and the balloon's deflated. Why? Why has that happened? Here's why it's happened. Not in small part. Remember those antennas out on the edge of the network? Well, those antennas now are 5G. 5G, as you know, is a standard that runs across multiple spectrum and builds a very high capacity, multi-gigabit network with lots of very good attributes like very low latency. Low latency means propagation delay back and forth to that which it is communicating with, which is very useful if you have autonomous vehicles that are driving very close to each other. That time delay could be problematic if one stops and the other does not. We also now have Wi-Fi 6, which, by the way, the Wi-Fi Alliance got together and said, 5G, we need a bigger number. And we'd really like something that's easier to remember than 802. I can't remember what the numbers are or the letters, and I don't know what they mean. So we now have Wi-Fi 6, which for you techies in the room is 802.11ax. By the way, also a multi-gigabit capable technology really built for inside of the premises, inside of homes or businesses. These two high-capacity antennas put on top of that infrastructure is literally like peanut butter and chocolate. You can't beat it. An electric plane isn't going to beat it. A balloon isn't going to beat it. There is no higher capacity network available. But not only is it the highest capacity, it's the lowest cost per bit, per mile, per service. Lowest cost per bit, per mile, per service. Anybody interested in building that? Why is it the lowest cost per bit, per mile, per service? It starts because it's one network. It runs all services. There's not two networks or three networks. We don't have an enterprise network or a residential network or a wireless backhaul network. It's all one network. So if you think about how much it costs to move a bit, if I can move all my bits down one network and I want to add bits, it's like frequent flyers. Frequent flyer miles came to pass because if you had an empty seat on a plane, you could fill it and the incremental cost was low. What's the analogy? On this network, incremental bits fly free. So when you look at what it takes to build a network, CapEx, and you just heard earlier Michael talking about City Fiber investing $3 billion in building a network to pass 5 million homes. From a CapEx standpoint, there is no less expensive network, starting with the fact that it's one network. So again, if you're building one network instead of two or three, there's no less expensive way to build one. But as all of you know from building networks, once you've built it, you have to operate it. And if you're building networks with a long view, OpEx kicks CapEx straight off the screen when it comes to cost, because you're running it over and over and over again. And so running that one network, by the way, back at the data center, instead of having three networks coming back into three systems, each with their own mechanisms, their own workflows, well, that's a lot more complicated than running one network with one workflow, one network with one set of outside plant structures. OpEx crushes CapEx, and OpEx is ultimately the way you have to become a disruptor. Old models won't do in the future. And so to be clear and to make a point, this is the lowest cost per bit, per mile, per service, CapEx and OpEx. So not electric planes, not nice-looking balloons. Is there anything out there that might disrupt this? Well, there might be one thing. And no, this is not, I don't think anybody put one of these on the table last night. Maybe you did. Bitcoin. How many of you have heard of Bitcoin, right? Everybody's heard of Bitcoin. How many of you have Bitcoins? How many of you know what they're worth currently at this moment? By the way, it's not Bitcoin. What potentially could disrupt us is blockchain. Blockchain is the underlying technology that enables Bitcoin to exist. So blockchain is one of those technologies that is sort of understood, sort of not well understood. We could spend quite a bit of time at a whiteboard talking about how it works. But the easiest way to think about it is, instead of having a centralized set of transactions, it allows for the ledger to be distributed. And specifically what it enables are trusted transactions. And it allows them to happen in a distributed fashion. It uses constructs, by the way, from a programming standpoint, that are used in file structures today, in Git file structures. So it allows you to have a trusted distributed ledger. Think about that, distributed, because distributed can change a lot. And so let's take a look at the physical structure just to make sure we understand. It's over here, the centralized structure. IBM mainframes. Everybody's connected on a terminal to the mainframe. That was a computer network. The structure that we're talking about now, which is really a decentralized environment, each node on that decentralized chart is a data center. They're interconnected. They move content and applications around to where they need to be. And we're all connected to one of those data centers. Blockchain, completely distributed. It is a nodal environment. So if you remember, the device-enabled subscriber over here, content and cloud over there, well, I'm a device-enabled subscriber. It's a computer. If I go into the data center, it's a computer. There are two computers communicating with each other, but they're communicating in a client-server structure. In a distributed environment, there's a computer at that node, there's a computer at this node. They're communicating in a peer-to-peer structure. Those are two very different ways for computers to speak to each other. Blockchain is, in fact, a peer-to-peer distributed environment. So what might happen out there? What might it disrupt? Well, we already talked about one, the cryptocurrency. By far, the best way to instantiate a cryptocurrency is with a blockchain ledger. And that's why there's been all the rage with Bitcoin. And if you follow the stock market, it's been like the tulip craze in the early 1900s. What's next? Well, currency is only one step away from banking. Banking is built on ledgers. Banking is built upon centralized systems that I build walls around and guard, and I try and securify those systems. The challenge when you securify things in a centralized system is those that want to penetrate it have an easy time identifying it. There's a big fort with a wall, let's attack it. Anybody, for example, had their credit records stolen? By the way, in case you're wondering, 1 out of every 2 people in the room had their credit file stolen. So the point is, trying to securify something that's centralized is very difficult because it, in fact, raises a big shining light for anyone that would like to attack it. In this environment, you have a ledger that is, in fact, distributed. And transactions are distributed across those ledgers. And they're mined by the different distributed nodes. What's another industry? No question about it. If there was ever an industry, voting, that called for a distributed secure ledger, it would be our voting system. Or we can continue to count hanging chads. Entirely up to us. I guess you have to be old enough to remember that one. Healthcare. Personal, private information, records. Those records should really follow me, not necessarily be centralized. They should be accessed by folks that I would like them to be accessed by, but not necessarily by others. Another industry that's really built to have a distributed ledger environment. By the way, if you want to talk about personal, how about this for personal? Anybody want to discuss social media? Anyone? Anybody want to talk about your personas being monetized in ways that you don't understand it? You can see this one coming, especially with what's going on. The notion of, I own my web persona, and I share it with who I choose to share it with. And it gets monetized in ways that I choose to have it monetized. And if you understand that, then you can understand that, in fact, media and content, many of you remember Napster? Remember the peer-to-peer file stealing? That's what this is, and that's what this enables. Not stealing, but distributed content. Think about the Netflixes of this world if, in fact, you move away from a server connected to a client model and move to a distributed ledger environment. These industries are right square in what blockchain is going to go and disrupt. But what's the effect on the network? What's the effect on our business? Well, let's take a look at that distributed environment. As you add more nodes to it, what happens? There's more connections. And very rapidly, these distributed nodes get interconnected in a way that is almost mind-bogglingly complex. What are you going to do with that? How are we all going to deal with that? Well, if you realize that these are logical connections, not physical connections, then in fact, here's how you deal with that. The same way you're dealing with everything else. The fact of the matter remains is what's different about this picture. Well, it's not a device-enabled subscriber world connected to content and applications because we just parsed up the content and split it out everywhere. So in fact, you have a set of distributed nodes that are going to connect physically over this to not a data center, but to a switching center. Welcome to the telephony network of the future. The most efficient way to build an access infrastructure is right in front of you, and that's how you're going to connect. So in fact, blockchain, which stands to disrupt a number of industries, actually further reinforces this end state network. We are together building an infrastructure that will last decades and can be monetized as such. So what's to do? That's the network. What's to do above it? What's to do above it is we have to own the subscriber experience, because you have a bunch of people. Kill me if I ever look like that, by the way. Just shoot me now. I made a comment during rehearsal. How many of you ever went to a party in college where everybody was, let's just say, a little under the influence and you weren't? If you've ever done that, you have an understanding of how I feel about when I look at that picture. It's like, really? But this is what we're providing. But owning that subscriber experience, paramount. When you listen to the Innovation Award winners, most of them are focused on doing exactly that, owning that subscriber experience, because that's the value. Providing an exceptional subscriber experience is the value in what we are doing. But oh, by the way, if you build this infrastructure, there's an opportunity to actually offer the infrastructure as a service. How many of you have heard of software as a service, infrastructure as a service, data centers, Amazon Web Services? Stop. Everyone in this room has the opportunity to become, in fact, an infrastructure as a service provider. In addition to owning the subscriber's experience, you have the opportunity to look for others that might want to, in fact, use those assets. Or you could take it to its extreme and be only an infrastructure as a service provider and ignore the subscriber. That's called a wholesaler. Most of us in this room are retailers. We're working with subscribers. But you could also be an open access wholesaler. What's really cool about what's coming and what we can build now that it's been imagined and it's real is the fact of the matter remains is the world's best retailers and the world's best wholesalers are building this right now. And the world's best retailers, in my opinion, from what I've seen, is the integrated intelligent edge network at Verizon and the new network that's being built by City Fiber. And so you're going to get a chance to see these two folks on stage, Verizon later today, I believe City Fiber tomorrow. Grab them in the hallways. Ask. Talk about their business models. I'd like to, but we found somebody that's been studying service provider business models for the last 20 years. A very wise gentleman who prior to that, believe it or not, was a professor of medieval studies. Now I want you to think for a moment, medieval studies, service providers. I'll leave it to all of you to think about how the analog works out, but I'd like to introduce Will Hahn from Gartner to take you through the work that he's done on service provider business models in the future and the evolution that's right in front of us.
Thank you, Carl. Great to see you.